Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about something really powerful. How language itself can, well, build an enemy. We'll be breaking down an academic paper that argues a dominant Western narrative, especially after 9/11, has systematically created a stigmatized identity for Muslims.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the core problem the paper identifies, this idea of a stigmatized identity. Then we'll get into the main tools for the analysis: discourse, power, and truth. From there, we'll see how it all applies to the post-9/11 world, look at some real-world examples in culture and politics, and then finally wrap up with why any of this really matters.
So where does an analysis like this even begin? Well, not with some abstract, high-flying theory, but with something really tangible. The paper's starting point is the very real, very public stigmatization that Muslims have faced.
And look, the paper doesn't just talk about this in the abstract. It gets right down to it with these vivid, pretty confrontational anecdotes. This one really sets the stage, because it's not just stating a problem, it's showing you the aggression it wants to understand. It really makes you ask, where do these kinds of attitudes even come from?
Now this is where it gets really interesting. At the heart of the paper's whole argument is this idea of a powerful double standard in how we frame things. It argues that when a person who is Muslim commits a violent act, it's immediately slapped with a label like Islamic fundamentalism. But when a Muslim is the one being attacked, you rarely see that same energy. It's often not framed in equivalent terms, like a racist or extremist attack.
Okay, so how do you even begin to analyze a phenomenon like that? Well, the paper moves beyond just listing examples. It brings in a really specific theoretical tool, borrowing from the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
And this tool is built on a pretty radical idea when you really think about it. That language isn't just a neutral mirror reflecting the world. The words we use, the stories we tell, they're not just describing our reality. They're actively creating it.
The key word here is discourse. Now, for Foucault, this isn't just, a chat or a conversation. It's a whole system of language, a way of thinking that's so powerful, it doesn't just talk about things, it actually forms the very subjects and ideas it's describing.
And that idea of discourse leads right into the next big concept, something called a regime of truth. This is just Foucault's fancy term for a society's unwritten rules about what gets to count as a fact. It's the powerful, often invisible system that decides which stories we accept as true and which ones we just dismiss.
So, you've got these three core ideas, right? How these big stories shape who we are, how knowledge and power are all tangled up, and how certain ideas just become, well, dominant. Now, let's see how the paper takes this entire toolkit and applies it to a single, world-changing event. All right, so the paper takes this whole framework and points it directly at a very specific, very impactful moment in modern history, the time right after the September 11th attacks. The authors argue this event dramatically ramped up a very particular story about Islam.
But before they dive into 9/11, the authors want to give some historical context. They point out that this relationship between the Islamic world and the West, it's not new, and it's certainly never been simple. It's been this long history of power shifting back and forth, from centuries of Islamic dominance to centuries of Western colonialism.
And here's a really stark example of how this kind of discourse can just flip on a dime. Let's talk about the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Back during the Soviet-Afghan War, the US was arming them, celebrating them as freedom fighters. But after the Soviets left, and those same fighters started resisting American influence, the label changed. Suddenly, they were terrorists.
So drawing on thinkers like Slavoj Zizek, the paper makes a pretty bold claim here. It argues that the war on terror wasn't just a simple reaction to an event. It was instead a carefully constructed narrative, a new dominant story that was institutionalized to make military action seem legitimate.
And to back up this view, the paper goes into some pretty controversial territory. It brings up claims from public figures like this alleged statement from John Kerry about World Trade Center 7. It uses this as an example of information that really challenges the official, dominant story of what happened that day.
The crucial point here, from the paper's perspective, is how details like this massive insurance payout were used by people to build a counterstory, to argue that the official narrative wasn't the whole picture. The paper includes this to show how the event was used to justify a whole new dominant discourse.
Okay, so after looking at the big geopolitical picture, the paper zooms in. It starts looking at how this post-9/11 narrative was spread and reinforced in our everyday lives, through books, political speeches, and, of course, the media.
First up, they look at American literature published after 9/11. The paper argues that you can see this discourse playing out right on the page. On one hand, you have novels like John Updike's Terrorist, which it claims reinforce stereotypes. And on the other, you have books like Amy Waldman's The Submission, which actually explored the anti-Muslim climate that resulted. And the paper uses these fictional accounts of hate crimes from Waldman's novel for a very specific reason, to show the very real, very ugly consequences of this kind of dominant story. It's showing how words and ideas can translate into actual violence and fear in the real world.
Then, the analysis pivots to political rhetoric. It highlights speeches like this one from the 2016 campaign. Now, the paper presents this as a perfect example of that discourse in action, framing radical Islam as this single, hateful enemy that you absolutely have to name.
And finally, the paper looks at the media. It points to the whole Danish cartoon controversy from 2006, and it argues this wasn't just some isolated incident, but another key piece of the puzzle. In the paper's view, the caricatures were a tool used to express what it specifically calls white racism and hatred against Islam.
So after laying out all of this evidence from history, politics, literature, and media, what's the bottom line? What's the big takeaway? Well, the paper wraps things up by explaining the real-world consequences of what it calls a hegemonic or dominant Western discourse.
At the end of the day, the paper concludes that this whole dominant story creates a really stark us versus them world. It creates this binary opposition between the West and Islam that just simplifies everything and relies on stereotypes and othering to turn an entire group of people into the bad guy.
You could almost see it as a kind of chain reaction, which is what this chart shows. According to the paper's logic, it all starts with that dominant discourse coming from powerful places like the media and politics. That, in turn, fuels stereotyping and othering, and that, ultimately, hardens into real-world stigmatization and Islamophobia.
And that really leaves us with a final, pretty heavy question to think about. If these powerful regimes of truth can actually shape our reality in such a profound way, what other big stories are shaping our world right now, maybe in ways we don't even see?